Long Voyage Back, page 359. Neil informed Scorpio of his intention to take off Jim, Lisa and Ollie, but said they should wait until dawn, 6 hours hence, to make the transfer. In the interim, Jim and Lisa should be kept isolated in their cabin. Oscar, who took the message, made no comment. Macklin came on duty at midnight. He was informed of the situation. Macklin grunted, asked Neil if there was anything special he wanted to said to Scorpio at the regular 2 a.m. radio check, and took the helm. Jim was down in her cabin with Skippy, satisfied that Lisa would be returned to her. Sheila, off watch, was down with Philip. Neil took over the helm while Macklin had a cup of tea. Compliments of the mollycoddle. "So what's the use of staying at sea?" Frank asked from a seat behind Neil. "The worst has happened out here. There's nothing left to run from." Neil was struck by how resigned Frank seemed to be. He still had expressed neither rage nor grief that his son might soon be in the grip of a fatal disease. "We're still not welcome anywhere," Neil replied. "And now, carrying what we carry, people are justified in asking us to stay away." "The whole world's dying, Neil," Frank said. "You'll never find a place that isn't." "No, I won't," Neil agreed. "Then why stay out here?" Frank said with sudden vehemence. "You're sick. You're becoming some sort of crazy Flying Dutchman, cursing yourself and anyone stupid enough to follow you to spend eternity sailing around and endlessly at sea." "I don't see it that way, Frank," Neil replied. "I see my best defence as being out here. The enemy's still bunched up mostly on land." Frank got up and came over to stand behind Neil. "So now you're ordering death brought directly on board," he said. "He's your son," Neil countered. "If it were Tony or Conrad who was sick, you'd throw him overboard," Frank insisted quietly. Neil hesitated, then replied evenly, "If it had been them at Salt Point, I never would have let them back on board. You're right there." "You'd throw them overboard," Frank repeated. Neil didn't answer. He knew he wouldn't literally throw them overboard, but he recognised the response would be quite different. "And how would you handle things, Frank?" "Put the sick ashore, split up, stop this fucking running." Neil smiled bitterly. "I'll stop running when he stops chasing," he said sadly. "You're mad." "Let's just say we handle it differently," Neil commented, turning the wheel over to Macklin, who had just come up on deck. 075 degrees. Keep an eye on the number 2 jib. It may be too much for her. Wake me up at 3:45. Good night." But Neil was not awakened at 3:45. He was awakened at dawn by the sound of something rubbing against Vagabond's port side. He sat up, instantly awake, listening for the sound again, and angry that daylight was there and he hadn't been called. The sound came again, a crunch and a squeal, something rubbing against the side. It even sounded like fenders rubbing against a dock, but Vagabond was hissing through the sea at good speed. She was also sliding down a wave, sliding downwind. She had altered course and was running west. He stood up, pulled on his cut-off jeans, reached over to slide his hatch open. It didn't open. He banged on it several times, almost instantly regretting that he had when he realised that his orders had been disobeyed and he was probably locked in his cabin. He went to get his gun from the berth and saw it was gone. So he could hear voices now, Frank and Tony's among them. The peculiar sounds he was hearing must be the two boats' hulls and fenders scraping against each other as Scorpio and Vagabond sailed downwind together. Neil banged on the hatch again and shouted loudly, calling Frank. He kept it up for a solid minute until finally he heard some fiddling with the padlock. The hatch slid open and Oscar, gun in hand, looked down at him warily. Neil climbed quickly up the steps and, even as Oscar began ordering him to stay put, brushed past him and made for the cockpit. On the port side, Scorpio was rafted to Vagabond. Tony, Mirabai and Janice were transferring food from Scorpio to the trimaran, the two women taking it down the Vagabond's galley. Macklin, with his 45, stood guard. Sheila was at the wheel, Ollie at Scorpio's. The two boats, under reduced sail, were sailing downwind in moderate trade wind. The sun was only a few degrees above the horizon in the clear sky. As Neil moved slowly towards the others, Frank, who was standing next to Sheila, turned to face him. "I asked to be awakened at 3:45, Neil said to him, harkening back instinctively to that first act of disobedience, as if being locked in his cabin and threatened with a gun were less noteworthy. "It's over, Neil," Frank said wearily, looking strangely beaten and resigned. I've retaken command of Vagabond. We're splitting up." Tony had waved off a cardboard carton of food that Mirabai was about to hand him and pulled out his gun. He now came cautiously towards the place where Neil was standing, just outside the old wheelhouse area on the starboard side. Macklin's gun was aimed at Neil now. "And what's all this transfer business?" Neil asked Frank, ignoring Tony. "Lisa and Jim are being left aboard Scorpio," Frank said. "Those who are still healthy are coming aboard Vagabond." Frank stopped, his eyes lifeless. He glanced at Tony. "Jean's elected to stay with them," Tony said. "That's where she is now. So is Ollie. We assume you will too." "And you're taking Vagabond to Barbados?" Neil asked Tony. That's right, Tony replied, holding the gun at his side. And since most of the people are coming with us, and you and Ollie think you can feed yourselves from the sea, we're also taking most of the food. Besides, if things don't work on Barbados, we'll have to keep sailing downwind until we find some island or some place in Colombia or Panama where we can make a go of it. I figure the weak little countries in the West Indies or Central America are a lot safer than places like Brazil. There are already a lot of Americans where we're going too. Ow! It's Hoople's cat. It's time for a giveaway. Would you like to win? If you do, want to win the Ultimate Survival slightly improved first aid kit, complete with improvised splint, all you have to do is email me at hoopelscat.youtube@outlook.com with your mailing address, and it'll be first come first served or a lucky draw depending on how you feel. Good luck! If you're going to land and I'm staying at sea, Neil said to Frank, then you should let me take Vagabond. You won't need either her space or windward ocean-going capacity. It's settled, Macklin said sharply. We're taking Vagabond. Scorpio's not seaworthy enough for the voyage I recommend, Neil persisted. But she's just as good at heading west. As soon as she stops having to beat windward, she'll stop leaking. Mac said it's settled, Tony snapped back. If you leave, you have to take Scorpio. He says it's settled, said Neil with a rush of anger. I don't. There was another tense silence. Frank also says so, as a ship's owner, Macklin replied stonily, and this gun says so too. You're choosing to abandon Jim? Neil asked Frank. He chose to go to Salt Point, Frank replied, looking dully at Neil. He chose Lisa. He chooses you. He has to take the consequences. He's your son, Neil said. He's dying, said Frank softly. Jim's already got the disease, Tony said. His temperature's already as high as Lisa's. The two boats, rubbing and rolling, suddenly spilled rapidly down the face of a wave, and everyone staggered or stumbled to regain his or her balance. Mirabai spilled a box of food onto the port cockpit deck. As he regained his balance, Neil felt a heaviness steal into him, the heaviness of giving up, the heaviness he'd experienced after long days of battling a storm at sea when the body says no more. I'll do it later. Sink the fucking ship. No matter how fast he ran, the forces of dissolution ran faster. He couldn't believe that the West Indies or Central America would offer anything but slow death. He couldn't believe that any land could be as safe as remaining out at sea for as long as possible. But with Scorpio, he no longer had a choice. Sheila and Philip, he asked almost to himself. Philip's too sedated right now to decide, Sheila answered. I feel his life may depend on getting to a physician soon. Scorpio, given the alternatives Tony's given us, I feel that Vagabond... You're right, of course, Neil said, nodding. Captain Ollie had turned Scorpio's helm over to Janice and came to the rail. Jean says she needs more of the Vagabond's towels, he said loudly to all of them. Neil saw now that the left side of Ollie's face was badly bruised, and his eye almost swollen shut. What's happened to you? Frank asked, frowning, and apparently he too was seeing Ollie up close for the first time. I ain't the ducker I used to be, he said, sniffing. Sorry I let you down, Cap, he added to Neil. Tell her to use old clothes, Tony responded. We're not parting with any of the Vagabond stuff. Get her some towels, Frank said to Mirabai, who brushed quickly past Tony and went below. Macklin was about to stop her, flushed with anger, then let her go and didn't comment. In a moment she reappeared with 3 rather ratty-looking towels from Jean's cabin and handed them across to Ollie. You win, Frank, Neil said loudly. I've decided I'm not going on that death ship either. I'm staying on the Vagabond. Mirabai, who was passing from the cockpit to the galley with Scorpio's food supplies, carried on indifferently when he said this, but everyone else who had heard him stopped and looked at him. Tony and Macklin with suspicion, Sheila and Frank with surprise. It's a trick, said Macklin. Don't trust him. It's quite simple, Neil went on. The doomed are going on the Scorpio and the winners are taking Vagabond. Although I may not be captain, I'm still free to choose the winners. What about Jean? Frank asked, looked at him with puzzled surprise. Yes, Frank, Neil replied, staring at him intently. What about Jean? I mean, she's doomed on Scorpio. Not if you're with her, Frank said. Let's cut this crap, Macklin said. Neil's sailing on Scorpio no matter what he wants. No, Conrad, no, Neil replied quietly with a half smile. That would be mutiny, and perhaps murder. You're capable of that, but Frank isn't. Can I keep my same cabin, Frank? I'm taking the aft cabin, Tony injected. I'm addressing the owner, Neil said, continuing to look at Frank. Do you really want to stay? Frank asked. As much as you do, Frank, as much as you. Me too, said Ollie, who'd been listening from the deck of Scorpio. Now he climbed aboard Vagabond with an exaggerated smile, rendered grotesque by his puffy face. Gotten so I prefer three-wheelers, he added. Get back on board Scorpio, Macklin shouted, nervous and angry. Of course the company is nice here, Ollie said, but I'm used to the stinking rotting of things, so... Tony instinctively lashed out at Ollie with his gun hand. When Ollie parried the blow and knocked the gun away, Macklin swung his gun into Ollie's chest, sending him back against the cockpit seat groaning. Hey! Frank yelled, rushing forward. Macklin levelled his automatic and flicked off the safety. Hold it! He snapped fiercely, backing into the corner of the cockpit and looking uneasily at Frank. Frank stopped only a few feet from where Tony was stooping to retrieve his gun. The charade's over, Macklin announced. Tony and I are taking over. What's that mean? Frank said, his fists clenched at his sides. It means Tony and I are taking Vagabond and you can join your friends on Scorpio. You little bastard, Frank growled. You couldn't handle Vagabond for a single second. Get off the boat, said Macklin. Jesus, you and Tony are clowns, said Frank, sneering. With a suddenness surprised everyone, he grabbed Tony's gun and tried to twist it free, using Tony's body as a shield. Crouching in the corner 10 feet away, Macklin trained his gun first on Frank and then on Neil, who had taken 3 quick steps forward towards him. Then he swung it back around and fired a single shot at the tangle of Frank and Tony. For a moment that tangle seemed to continue its wrestling unaffected, but then Frank slumped to the cockpit floor. Tony, breathing heavily, straightened up and stared down fearfully at his fallen adversary. Macklin, sweating, turned his gun back on Neil. Jean appeared in Scorpio's cockpit next to Janice at the helm. What happened? She asked into the silence towards Vagabond. Macklin wheeled towards her with a scowl. Get back below or I'll kill you. Get below, Sheila shouted to her. He shot Frank. A look of shock appeared on Jean's face, and then she moved slowly past Janice to Scorpio's starboard rail. She could now see Frank's bleeding body in the Vagabond's rear cockpit. Oh my God, she said, and climbed aboard. Tony Mirabai, still worried about infection, quickly left the cockpit area to avoid it. Mirabai returned to Scorpio and Tony came into the wheelhouse. As Jean knelt beside Frank's fallen body, Macklin held his gun on Neil. Oscar, he said, put the barrel of your gun in Loken's back and escort him over onto Scorpio. As Neil felt Oscar's gun press into his back, he began walking towards Macklin, who was still crouched back against the far corner of the cockpit, his eyes darting nervously. The 2 boats were sailing serenely forward at 6 knots, still lashed side by side, rubbing and crashing, but held off by their fenders. Neil glanced at Sheila as he passed her at the helm and hoped she might try to help.